Hi, I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior consultant at Delta Think and one of the Charleston Conference directors. Very excited to be here today with Kamran Naim. Kamran is head of open science, which he's going to tell us a little bit more about at CERN, and he's joining us from Switzerland. Good afternoon, Kamran. How
Hey,
are
good
you?
afternoon. I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, so let's kick off. Maybe tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you're working on now, and then we'll delve a little bit more deeply into some aspects of your background.
Sure. At the moment, I am, as you mentioned, the head of open science at CERN. CERN is uh, the acronym is actually in French. It's essentially the European Organization for Nuclear Research. In French, the term that they use is Conseil, so Conseil Européen de la Recherche Nucléaire. But it is the world's largest um, research organization. Um, it was founded in 1954 um, in the kind of post Second World War Europe as a project not only to advance our fundamental understanding of you know basic scientific questions about who we are and where we come from, but also um, as an instrument to get European countries to work together on a common scientific mission. And so there's also kind of this inherent sort of science for peace or science diplomacy aspect to the organization. We are the home to the world's largest scientific instrument. It's called the Large Hadron Collider. It is a particle accelerator facility that is about 100 meters underground, 23 kilometers in circumference. And in that facility, we accelerate particles to 99.9999999% the speed of light. And those particle collisions are captured um, at uh, at four different points, which are the homes to the four different experiments, or the four detectors. They're essentially massive cameras, so massive that they're about the size of the Milan Cathedral. The particle collisions take place at temperatures that are about 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun, or energies that are about 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. And the magnets of the accelerator itself are the coldest place in the known universe at about 2 degrees Kelvin. There are about 12,000 people working across the research collaborations at CERN every day. So it is a big, very complex, very dynamic research environment. And honestly, it's a privilege to be working here and to have the opportunity to work on open science, and in particular making sure that all of the results of the research that we conduct at CERN are made fully publicly and meaningfully available, is an ongoing challenge, and one that is yeah, I don't know how I landed this role, but here I am trying to do my best.
Yeah, well, thanks for that explanation. There's so many parts of that that I was not aware of, and I can imagine that I'm not the only kind of wannabe science geek that's listening to that. So I'm going to have to go back and delve into that a little bit more deeply. So you mentioned the interest in open science, open research, and this is not just a new thing. You didn't just wake up yesterday and say, "Aha." Open science. It's been like, about more than 20 years that you've been interested in that. How did that get started for you, that interest?
Sure. So I think it kind of goes back to um, sort of the early 2000s, and my not necessarily failed, but I attempted to work in corporate finance for a few years, and then I realized that it just was not for me, and making rich people even richer wasn't something that brought me fulfillment personally. And I sort of following completing my undergraduate degree had spent some time in the corporate sector, and um, realized that I really needed to sort of do a pivot. And at the time, My parents had been separated by circumstance. My dad was posted to Tunisia, and my mom was in Pakistan, which is where my family's originally from. And she was undertaking a project to kind of build a house, and I found myself, kind of free and with some time, and so I went back to Pakistan. I hadn't really spent a lot of time there in the past, and never really worked there. But my mom was a senior science advisor for the Pakistani government and ran the Pakistan Council for Science and Technology. And at a social event, I ran into the Minister for Science and Technology at the time, his name was Ataur Rahman, who had at that time been given the charge of 4 different ministries: so education, communication, and communication technology, higher education, and science and technology. And so he asked me to get involved in a World Bank project that was looking at higher education reform in Pakistan. And I thought that sounded quite interesting. And it was sort of my first opportunity to really give back to the country of at least my parents' birth. And so I started a role working on a World Bank project as part of the reforms. And on one of the first days at work, I received a note, actually written on a post-it, by my boss, that said, "We need to establish a digital library for universities in Pakistan. Please advise." And so that was really the very beginning of kind of my foray into scholarly publishing and academic journals. I really knew very little about it, but in the course of a couple of years, what we developed was a national level model where we arranged access, negotiated preferential access for the country to cover all educational institutions, and that work ended up sort of garnering not only the attention of the World Bank. They wanted to use it as a model, so I ended up kind of replicating that model in a few other places. Madagascar was the most interesting one, and kind of related to that work, the project ended up getting quite a lot of attention, and particularly caught the attention of some AAAS fellows who were working on a project to help reconnect the Iraqi research community to academic journals. Now, as many of the listeners might know, Iraq had probably until about the 1960s, 1970s, the country was home to some of the most prestigious research institutions and universities in the region, and some of the most impressive libraries probably in the world. And as an unfortunate consequence of the first Gulf War, the sanctions that were put into place meant that publishers couldn't sell their content into the countries, and the other consequence of Saddam Hussein's regime was that he had really militarized the higher education sector, and actually extracted all the leading scientists and put them into roles in military organizations. So this was really a part of kind of rebuilding the civic sector in Iraq, and so this project that I ended up working on was bringing me to Washington D.C. for quite a while. It was called the Iraqi Virtual Science Library, and that work ended up sort of snowballing. And when the Obama administration took over, they wanted to use that model to basically replicate it as a kind of improving relationships between the Muslim world and the U.S. through scientific collaboration. And so we kind of ended up replicating this model and working across all of North Africa. And then one of the AAAS fellows that I worked on the Iraqi Virtual Science Library project ended up becoming the first science advisor for USAID, and uh, then had me do similar work in East Africa. And so this is a very long winded way of saying that, really, so my principal interest was really this notion of enabling researchers from communities that had been deprived of access, either because of the high cost of accessing scientific content or because of political situations or infrastructural situations, making sure that they had access to scientific knowledge and that they were connected to the scientific world. Um, and so that was kind of my principal motivation. And really, as someone who was the son of diplomats and spent a lot of my time growing up in the developing world, and seeing kind of the real problems that people face on a day-to-day basis, and then learning that actually really scientific knowledge is such a huge contributor to socioeconomic development, that if we can help level the playing field there, we can really help improve the living conditions of people all around the world. And so that was really what motivated my sort of work in at least information access. But I
Yeah,
didn't get
if I can
to
interrupt you
the,
for a
yeah,
second, because I want
sure,
to get on.
please.
I want to get on to the next step, but I would be remiss because here I have to play the role of like all listeners. What was so interesting about Madagascar?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all, it's so stunningly beautiful. At the time when I was working there, it was, I think, the second poorest country in the world, and the the resource situation was really hard. The institutions actually really didn't even really have any connectivity. So trying to come up with a way of of enabling digital access to content was a major challenge, and one that I wrote a report and made a lot of recommendations, but I don't know if they were really actionable given the infrastructure situation. But I mean, it was a beautiful country. I think something like 80% of the flora and fauna in Madagascar is endemic to Madagascar. So just being there and seeing this huge, rich diversity of plants and animals and wonderful, warm people. Yeah, it was a really incredible experience. But
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I think a lot of us,
sure,
especially those of us who had kids that have been small recently, everything we know about Madagascar came from the Disney movies.
yeah,
So it's good to have like
sure,
a richer explanation. Now, um, at one point, you ended up at an NASP meeting, and I know a lot of our listeners will be from a little bit familiar with that project, but maybe just how did you end up at that meeting? Just a one sentence on what
sure.
it is and how that got you actually to kind of the next juncture in your career.
Okay, so also just to say that INAS were really instrumental in the work that I had been doing, because they had been working with publishers and arranging for negotiated access for the developing world for many years. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was kind of piggybacking off their efforts, and then also the efforts of the Research for Life projects. So I had the problem that I've been trying to solve, particularly in the work that I was doing in East Africa, was a question of discoverability, and usability of resources. If you put together all of the journals that are available through the Research for Life programs, the 3 or 4 different programs that they have now, that collection of journals is comparable to what anyone, even at Cornell, would have, right? So it wasn't that researchers weren't eligible to be able to access content. It was just the way that content was delivered. There was, only one username and password given to an institution, and that typically ended up staying with one person who wouldn't necessarily communicate it super well to everybody else, and a whole load of other constraints. So um, at the time, the solution that we worked on was a campus-based solution where we developed a search interface, and that one that indexed all of the programs, and if you found an article that you wanted and you clicked on the full text, it would embed the user and password in the link for you and retrieve the paper. And we came up with solutions as well that, in situations where bandwidth was low, it would download overnight and then be delivered to you the next morning. Now, I'll say that that was the project that I presented at the INAS symposium. And, at the time, I still had a lot of enthusiasm around what I was doing. And in retrospect, when I look at it now, I think, in effect, that project was a failure. And one of the reasons it was a failure was that we hadn't, and I'll take responsibility for it, I hadn't done probably enough contextual research to really understand user behavior. And the reality was that even like at that time, which was about 2011, 2012, East Africa had already leapfrogged local area networks and kind of wired internet, and everyone was on their cell phones. And just like everybody else, they were on Google and all their search behavior was on Google. So trying to take them away from, the place where they lived, which was in Google, and try to bring them to somewhere else didn't really work. And the fact that they were also only accessing their internet through mobile devices, whereas our solution was on campuses, it wasn't the most effective way of delivering access to the community that we wanted to serve. And for me, it was a really good lesson that I put into practice now. I hope hopefully for the rest of my career, where I know that if you're ever trying to build something for people, really do your research contextually and really try and understand. So I was invited to the INAS symposium, which was in 2012, to give a talk on the work that I've been doing. And at the time still had a lot of enthusiasm around it. And, but, right after I spoke, a gentleman came up and was, kind of the speaker that came on after me, and had, I had made like a slide deck that I spent weeks on, and fancy animations and all this stuff to kind of, put all the bells and whistles in. And he came on with no slides and just in this kind of characteristic, charming, brilliant, funny way, made me completely rethink what I had been
Why don't
working
you
on
say
for
who it
years.
was? Because many of our listeners will.
Yeah, so sure. So his name is John Walensky, and those of you who are familiar with him will recognize it. He's that kind of character, super compelling and extremely eloquent and provocative. And he essentially made me realize that I was working on the wrong part of the problem, that it wasn't about negotiating, discounted or preferential access for under-resourced communities as kind of an act of charity. That instead, really what we needed to be thinking about was what's best for global science, and what's best for global science is to have scientific knowledge be a public good. And that means that it should be freely accessible to everybody. And that was the moment where, I thought, oh my God, like I've been working on the wrong thing. And so in the 15 minutes that he talked, he kind of flipped my world upside down. And I, had to approach him after he spoke and just said, wow, like, thank you so much. And, could we maybe have a drink, because I'd love to learn more. And, I had some basic familiarity with open access, but hadn't really delved into it much until John's talk. And so, we ended up going for a drink, which ended up turning into dinner. He was extremely generous with his time. And at the end of the night, I looked at him and said, hey, I would love the opportunity to work with you. And he said, well, have you ever thought about doing a PhD? And, then I had my mother's voice in my head, who had been pushing me to do a PhD. She wanted me to be a doctor. And because I obviously didn't choose the medical path, then she'd been pushing me to just get a PhD. But she always advised me that where you go doesn't really matter. What really matters is your supervisor. And in my head, I had that, that notion from my mom, and I looked across the table and I saw John, and I was like, this is the guy. So I applied, and 9 months later, I was driving cross country and moving to Stanford, and where I did my PhD on collective approaches for open access.
Yeah, that's a great story. I think for those of us who have connections to getting started in things from their family, my father's a statistician, and I used to work at the computer center at Ohio State, and my mother's a now retired nurse, and my brothers both worked at the hospital. My sister worked where I worked, so we each kind of got introductions to the academia through our parents. So it's interesting how your mom first got you going, and how her little voice
He sure
in your
did.
head spurred you on. So I guess for those of us listening, those of you listening out there, either be careful what your parents want for you, or what you might commit to on their behalf when you hear that little voice. So some folks may be familiar with you because of some of the very early work you did on a model called Subscribe to Open. Can you talk a little bit about how that model, kind of came to be, and how you worked on it?
Sure. So, one of the things I want to add, just as part of this narrative, is that I was 35 when I started my PhD, and so it's never too late. And I moved cross country, and in my early investigations around open access, I realized that the dominant approaches, and which actually endure to this day, largely article-based approaches, still treat scientific knowledge as a commodity, and so my work was really driven by this goal to come up with approaches that change the status of research to being a public good. And so that was the essence of what I was trying to pursue at Stanford in my research work. And but at the same time, I was 35, and moving to Stanford and being a PhD student, and being in one of the most expensive places in the United States, if not one of the most expensive places in the world, and not being able to adjust my living and spending habits, I realized I need to have a job. And so after completing my first year, I started looking around, and I have to thank Andrea Lopez from Annual Reviews for pointing out a role that they had uh, that opened up, and I applied, and uh, thankfully was hired by them in the same week that Richard Gallagher, who's the president and editor in chief of Annual Reviews, started. And we had somewhat of a serendipitous meeting within the first couple of weeks, where he asked me what I was interested in and what I was working on, and I think he had really come to Annual Reviews and recognized the value um, that their content holds for the general public. Some of the reviews can be a little bit on the technical side, but really having an expert synthesize the current status of a research topic, tell you what the major contributions are, what the directions are for future research, that there was a real kind of public value aspect to it. And so his kind of drive to want to try and find an open access solution for review publications, which didn't really exist at that time, plus my my drive to explore collaborative approaches for open access, seemed to like serendipitously meet at the right time. Now, so we immediately started thinking about, okay, like, how can we explore making Annual Reviews open?
Yeah, maybe
And
I can just point out the obvious, because it took me, I mean, and I've been familiar with Annual Reviews for a long time, but at the start, it took me a bit to put two and two together. But if you're going to invite, as you say, a really renowned expert in the field to write this synthesis, this overview, you cannot then end that invitation with, "Oh, and please pay, X thousands of dollars."
we're going to charge you thousands of dollars for the privilege. Yeah, it's
Yeah, so
bad
that
manners, right?
wasn't APC-based model was not going to be a model that worked for Annual Reviews. So the world benefits from the fact that annual reviews needed to find another way for a variety of different reasons,
Yeah,
equitable access, but
indeed.
also just very practical day-to-day reasons. So sorry to interject there, but
Yeah. No, not at all. And it's like a really important contribution because, yeah, there really wasn't a ready solution for any reviews to make their content open. And I think in particular, Richard was interested in pursuing a model that would make this research that he believed had high public value to be a public good, and that would mean that it would be free for both authors and for readers. So I will say that at the time, the there was some reluctance, particularly amongst the board, of annual reviews, and annual reviews had existed for a very long time, and um, was very well used and very well respected, and there was some notion that the journals had reached the audience that they needed to have reached, um, because also the amazing work of Andrea Lopez and her team, um, with a truly global reach. The content was never actually really that expensive. The journals weren't super expensive, and still aren't very, considering the value that they deliver. So there was a real question of like, oh well, should we really do this? And so there was a little bit of reluctance from the board, and um, so what we realized was, okay, if we're going to try and do something, maybe we should get some external funding, and and use that to do a pilot, and then maybe we'll be able to generate some data and some evidence that we could then use to convince the board that it was the right thing. And so we saw a call from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation at that time, and submitted a proposal to make the one of NU's the most important journals, NU of Public Health, open access. And we were successful in getting that grant. And I got the news for that while I was attending, I think, an ALA meeting in Boston. And the really funny thing is that I remember getting that email and reading it as I was in the elevator coming down from my room to the lobby, and just thinking, "Oh my God, fantastic! We got the grant." And then thinking, um, "Oh, now we actually have to do the work and try and figure this out." And then I was just thinking, like, who could who could I work with? Who has the expertise? And miraculously, when I got to the ground floor, the elevator's doors opened, and who did I see but Raim Crow? And I thought, oh my God, it took about another serendipitous moment. I immediately cornered Raim, and said, hey, we've just got this grant, and we've got this project, and is this something you'd be interested in? And and I guess the rest is history in some way, because collectively with Raim, Richard, myself, and of course the team at Annual Reviews, we not only successfully piloted um, the conversion of the Annual Review of Public Health to open access, but the results of opening the journal were so impressive, and particularly in terms of reach and usage, like a tenfold increase over the space of a year in terms of usage, and global usage expanding so much that we realized there was really this incredible untapped demand for that kind of review journal content, which was a very compelling argument for the board. And in subsequent years, they went from one journal to 5 journals, and now the entire Annual Reviews portfolio is on Subscribe to Open. And as you now know, there's a community of practice and other publishers having their own offerings, and just very recently Project Muse, which is huge, converting their content to open via Subscribe to Open, and the Biochemical Society and Bio1 is now working on their Subscribe to Open offer for next year. And it's just really amazing to see that the model kind of come to life. But that's the origin story for
Yeah,
you.
no, thanks for that, and actually for the background on annual reviews. It's quite possible that we may have some listeners that had not heard of annual reviews before. Annual Reviews purchased Charleston conference and Charleston Hub. So it's good for folks to know that backstory, which I had eagerly followed along. Um, I would imagine there is a scenario where you would have just stayed and happily worked at Annual Reviews forever, but we know that that didn't happen. That you were wooed across the globe again. How did CERN come into the picture?
So, I think it is true. It is true that given the opportunity, I would have, or given that scenario, I could have stayed at Annual Reviews for the rest of my life. It's such a fabulous place. It's, you know, a, a nonprofit. Um, they do incredible work. There's incredible leadership there. It was such a fantastic place to work, but I did reach a point where I had felt like the major contribution that I wanted to make had been sort of delivered. Um, of course, there's always new things that you can work on, but at least for me, I was looking for sort of the next challenge, and um, I was I had been invited to a conference in Bielefeld in Germany um, in early 2019, and I was presenting on Subscribe to Open, and there was um, someone there from CERN. His name's Alex Coles, who is the leader of the Scientific Information Service at CERN, and he approached me after my talk and said, "Hey, we have a role at CERN that would like you to apply for," um, and it just so turned out that that role was managing the operations of SCOAP3, um, which is the sponsoring consortium for open access publishing in particle physics. And it's the world's largest open access initiative in terms, large collective open access initiative and largest disciplinary open access initiative. So there's over 3,000 institutions that are part of the collective and have, it's now the project's been running for a decade and have again delivered full open access to research in the discipline of high energy physics with no author fees. And so really, embodies the values of the open access movement. And so for me, the opportunity to work on the world's largest open access program was just too thrilling to pass up. And also just on the personal level, my husband and I had for many years always taken our vacations in Europe, and I talked about moving to Europe at some point. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, here's our chance." So, a few months later, I was packing up our home in LA and moving across the pond to Switzerland. It's been 5.5 years now. So,
Wow, and your
um,
pronunciation when you gave the French name, which was so wonderful, leads me to believe you speak more than a little French.
uh, that would that would be a complete
No.
misinterpretation. My French is terrible. My pronunciation is great.
Mhm.
My spoken French is terrible.
All right. Well,
Yeah, I could pronounce French like a local, but I can't construct a sentence to save my life. So,
all right. Well, good to know. We'll find someone else to be our guide when we come over to visit. So, really, since the earliest days you mentioned in the Iraqi Digital Library and like, you were working in very close proximity to librarians and working with some at least some feedback from librarians and on through during your time in Annual Reviews. So, how because we'll have a lot of librarian listeners to this and viewers, how have you found those collaborations to kind of have enriched your experience?
so I have to say that working with librarians has been sort of um, the the antidote to a toxic past career of working in the corporate sector, because they're some of the most wonderful and delightful people you could ever choose to work with. I think like librarians and school teachers and nurses and doctors are the ones that really do God's work. And so it's really been an absolute privilege working with the library community, and and particularly since being at CERN, our collaboration has 47 countries from all over the world participating in it, and the core contact points for each country are librarians. And yeah, so through my time at Annual Reviews and through actually even the Iraqi Virtual Science Library project, I've been working with librarians, and yeah, it's every day working with librarians is a privilege. And I don't know if I work in the Scientific Information Service, which used to be the CERN Library, so I don't know if I could be considered some form of
Librarian
librarian
by
or
osmosis.
information. Exactly. But just to say that they're an incredible group. And actually just this past week I was in South Africa, where we had a CERN UNESCO school for actually focused on open science. It used to be called the Digital Library School. We now call it the Open Science School. And we had librarians from all over the African continent attend, and just like librarians from anywhere else, they're kind and smart and brilliant, and um, you know uh, innovative, and just lovely people. So it's been working with the library community has been the privilege of a lifetime, honestly.
Great. Now I have to ask, because so many key turning points in your life and your career have kind of manifested themselves while you have been at conferences or events. What events are you looking forward to in the year to come? So we can just only imagine how you're going to manifest to next level at those events.
So recently, I've taken on an additional role at CERN, which is the director of the European, as one of the directors of the European Open Science Cloud Association. There's a lot of cool things that we're doing, working on the infrastructure side at Europe. Um, the so I've sort of pivoted away a little bit from the sort of the library conference space into more of the open science space. There's a meta science conference which is taking place in London at the end of June, actually beginning of July, and I'm really looking forward to that because it's got a really diverse program. There's a lot of you know a lot of things that are very relevant for libraries. It should be an excellent event. There's an Open Science Monitoring Initiative conference in Paris the following week, and I would be remiss if I didn't give a little plug for the Open Science Fair that we are hosting at CERN in partnership with Open Air in September, where we're going to be tackling a lot of um, sort of the open questions around open science. The focus of the conference is on collaboration, and we're going to be delving into lots of different topics that I think really are in the domain of libraries. There's going to be a whole session on diamond open access, which I'm really pleased to see is finally gaining some traction after 20 years of um, of commercial dominance. We're starting to see, I think, a little bit of a pivot in the industry, and so I'm um, super looking forward to having those conversations. And yeah, there's always a, a rich slate of events to attend. Early next year, there's going to be a Charleston conference in Thailand, which I hope to be able to attend.
Yeah, I think we're all
And
trying to maybe manifest that. It's
indeed,
wonderful to see you, moving on, including more focus on infrastructure and collaboration. I think so many of the players in the open science, open research space are, recognizing, or at least being more vocal about the fact that it's not the article, it's the actual scientific process and all of the
absolutely.
aspects of that we should focus on. So I think we should look at say where's Cameron headed, and then the rest of us try to rush and catch up. But
Oh, no, not at all. I try and follow the example of so many brilliant people that are working and exist in this space. So I'm just, I'm learning as I'm going.
Great. It's been fantastic, as always, to talk with you today. Thank you for spending time with
Likewise,
us, and
Heather.
we can't wait to see where you go to next. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.